What's the most disturbing thing you've ever found while cleaning out someone else's belongings? My great-aunt Cordelia died when I was 22, leaving me her Victorian house in Salem. I'd only met her twice, once at my 8th birthday party, where she gave me a music box that played the same haunting melody for hours, and again at my high school graduation where she whispered, "You have her eyes. Be careful." I never knew what she meant. Cordelia had been the family recluse. My mother would change the subject whenever I asked about her, muttering something about old family business and things better left buried. Dad would just shake his head and walk away. When I'd press for details, Mom would get this distant look and say, "Cordelia always saw things that weren't there. It's better not to encourage her delusions." When the lawyer called about the inheritance, my parents seemed genuinely shocked. "Why would she leave everything to you?" Mom asked, her voice tight with something I couldn't identify. "You barely knew her. Maybe she saw something in me at graduation," I said, trying to lighten the mood. Mom's face went white. "What exactly did she say to you that day?" "Just that I had someone's eyes and to be careful. Probably meant I looked like you." "No," Mom whispered. "You look like Rebecca." Rebecca was my mother's younger sister who died in a car accident when I was 5. Mom rarely talked about her, claiming it was too painful. The house had been abandoned for 3 years before Cordelia's death. She'd moved to a nursing home after a stroke. When I arrived with cleaning supplies and trash bags, the smell hit me immediately. Not decay exactly, but something musty and sweet, like old flowers left too long in water. Every room was frozen in time. Newspapers from 1987 stacked on tables, teacups with dried rings still sitting on doilies, family photos covering every surface. But strangely, none included my mother, or anyone from our immediate family. It was as if Mom's entire branch had been erased from Cordelia's life. I started in the kitchen, working methodically through cabinets filled with china from the 1940s. Behind a false back in the pantry, I found a small metal box locked with an old padlock. It took me 20 minutes with a screwdriver to pry it open. Inside were dozens of letters tied with black ribbon, all addressed to "My dearest sister Margaret," in Cordelia's spidery handwriting. My mother's name was Margaret. The first letter was dated 35 years ago. "Margaret, I know you think I'm interfering, but someone has to protect the girls. What Richard is doing isn't normal brotherly affection. I've seen the bruises on your arms after Sunday dinners." My hands started shaking. Richard was my grandfather, the man who'd taught me to fish and given me silver dollars. The second letter. "I found Rebecca crying in the garden again today. She's only 12, Margaret. She begged me not to tell anyone, but I can't stay silent anymore. Not when I see what he's doing to both of you." Rebecca was my mother's younger sister. She died in a car accident when I was 5, or so I'd been told. The third letter made my blood run cold. "I'm calling the police tomorrow, Margaret. I don't care what it does to the family name. Richard molested Rebecca for years, and now he's starting with the others. Your own daughter will be next if someone doesn't stop this." I dropped the letters, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Richard was my grandfather, Mom's father. He died when I was 16, and everyone always talked about what a wonderful man he'd been. Kind, generous, the type who gave kids silver dollars and taught them to fish. But Cordelia was talking about child abuse, about my mother being a victim, about someone being next. I picked up the fourth letter with trembling fingers. "Margaret, I saw what happened at Easter dinner, the way he touched her during grace, his hand under the table. She's only 7 years old. I'm begging you to protect her. If you won't, I will." The fifth letter was angrier. "You moved away without warning. One day you're here, the next you've packed up and left for Boston with no forwarding address. I know you're trying to protect your daughter by running, but what about the other children? What about the cousins who come to visit? Your silence enables his access to new victims." I sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by 40-year-old accusations that painted my beloved grandfather as a monster. Every family story, every fond memory suddenly felt contaminated. Had my mother known? Had she been a victim herself? I thought about Mom's strange behaviors over the years. How she'd never let me stay overnight at any relative's house alone. How she'd always insisted on being present during family gatherings. How she'd react with panic anytime I mentioned spending time with male relatives unsupervised. How she'd moved us 6 hours away from the rest of the family when I was 8, claiming Dad's job required the relocation. I'd always assumed she was overprotective. Now I wondered if she'd been trying to protect me from something specific. The next letter was different. Desperate. "Margaret, you're a coward. You're choosing your family's reputation over children's safety. Rebecca attempted suicide last night. She's 14 years old, and she wanted to die rather than face another family Christmas with him. How can you live with yourself?" My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the paper. Aunt Rebecca had attempted suicide? I'd always been told she died in a car accident at 19, that she'd been driving too fast on a rainy night, lost control, and hit a tree. It was family lore, the tragic story of a beautiful young woman whose life was cut short by a moment of reckless driving. The letters continued chronologically, documenting years of Cordelia's frustration as she tried to expose what was happening. She'd contacted police, social services, church leaders. Each attempt had been thwarted by the family closing ranks, discrediting her as the hysterical spinster who'd never had children of her own and didn't understand normal family dynamics. One letter from 1978 detailed her meeting with a detective. Officer Rodriguez seemed sympathetic at first, but when he called to follow up, he said the family had provided character references for Richard from half the town. The pastor vouched for him. The mayor spoke of his charitable work. My own mother called me mentally unstable. Without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, there was nothing they could do. Another from 1981. "I caught him again today. Rebecca was helping in the basement workshop, the same workshop where he used to take Margaret. I hid behind the furnace and watched him touch her inappropriately. When I confronted her afterward, she begged me not to tell anyone. She said Mother had already called her a liar once, and if anyone found out she was dirty, she'd be sent away. She's 15 years old and convinced that being abused makes her worthless. The letters painted a picture of systematic gaslighting by the entire family structure. Anyone who spoke up was labeled as disturbed, jealous, or attention-seeking. The victims were blamed for misunderstanding innocent affection or exaggerating normal family interactions. Then I found the photographs. At the bottom of the box was a manila envelope marked, "Evidence, do not destroy." Inside were Polaroid pictures, grainy, dark, but clear enough to see what was happening. A man's hands on a small girl's body. The girl's face was turned away, but I recognized the bedroom from family albums. My mother's childhood room. There were more photos. Different girls, different ages, but always the same predator. In one image, I could see the man's face, partially. It was definitely my grandfather. My stomach twisted as I realized what Cordelia had done. She'd been documenting evidence, building a case that no one would believe or act upon. These weren't just accusations. They were proof. But the timestamp on several photos confused me. They were dated in the 1980s and 1990s, years after my mother had moved away with me. Who were these other children? I found answers in the next set of letters, addressed to different family members. Letters to Uncle Michael, warning him about bringing his daughter Bethany to family gatherings. Letters to cousin Patricia, suggesting she reconsider letting her sons spend summers at Grandpa's farm. Letters to church leaders, expressing concern about my grandfather's volunteer work with youth programs. Each letter was met with either silence or angry responses, accusing Cordelia of spreading malicious rumors about a respected community member. The final letter in the box was dated just 3 years ago, a year before Cordelia's stroke. To whoever finds this after I'm gone, if you're reading this, it means my family succeeded in silencing me, but I hope you'll be braver than they were. The man who hurt these children never faced consequences. He died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by people who called him a good man. Margaret enabled his abuse by staying silent. She chose protecting the family image over protecting children. She has lived with this secret for 40 years, and it has eaten away at her soul. Look at what it's cost her: anxiety, depression, an inability to trust anyone completely. She passed this trauma down to her own daughter without even realizing it. The cycle continues unless someone stops it. I sat in that dusty kitchen for 3 hours, reading every letter twice, studying every horrible photograph, trying to reconcile this nightmare with everything I thought I knew about my family. As the sun began to set, I started exploring the rest of the house with new purpose. In the living room, I found photo albums that told a different story than the ones I'd grown up seeing. These albums were organized chronologically, documenting family gatherings over 6 decades. The early photos from the 1950s and 1960s showed normal family scenes, birthdays, holidays, graduations, but as I studied them more carefully, I noticed patterns. Young girls standing as far from my grandfather as possible, children with forced smiles and tense body language, adults who seemed to be deliberately positioning themselves between the children and one particular man. In a 1967 Christmas photo, I found my mother as a child, maybe 7 years old, pressed against the arm of a chair, trying to put distance between herself and my grandfather, who was reaching toward her. Her face showed pure terror disguised as a smile. A photo from Rebecca's 8th birthday party in 1971 showed her hiding behind my grandmother, peeking out with hollow eyes while my grandfather held a present, trying to coax her closer. The albums documented the gradual disintegration of normal family dynamics as more people became aware of what was happening, but felt powerless to stop it. By the 1980s, the photos showed significantly fewer children at family gatherings. Certain family members had stopped attending altogether. In the basement, I found filing cabinets full of research that showed how deeply Cordelia had investigated the problem. Newspaper clippings about child abuse cases, legal documents about statutes of limitations, contact information for victims' advocacy groups. She'd spent decades trying to find a way to expose what had happened. One folder contained correspondence with lawyers, asking about legal options for historical abuse cases. The responses were discouraging. Most crimes were beyond the statute of limitations, and without living victims willing to testify, prosecution would be nearly impossible. Another folder held psychological research about the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse. Cordelia had studied the patterns of behavior in adult survivors, clearly trying to understand what my mother and Rebecca were experiencing. In her bedroom, I found journals dating back 50 years. The early entries were normal. Complaints about work, excitement about dates, family gossip. But starting in the late 1960s, the tone changed. Entry after entry documenting her growing suspicions about her father's behavior around young girls. One entry from 1971 stood out. I found Margaret hiding in the closet today, bruises on her legs. When I asked what happened, she said she fell down the stairs. But I've seen those same bruises on Rebecca. And I've noticed how both girls flinch when father hugs them goodbye. I'm starting to understand what's really happening in this house, and it makes me sick. Another from 1975. I confronted Mother about what I suspect. She became hysterical, screaming that I was trying to destroy our family with lies. She said if I ever mentioned such filthy accusations again, I'd be disowned. But I know what I've seen. I know what's happening to my sisters. The journals painted a picture of a woman becoming increasingly isolated as she tried to protect children from a predator everyone else refused to acknowledge. By the 1980s, Cordelia's entries showed clear signs of depression and desperation. From 1983, Rebecca graduated high school today. She should be celebrating, planning for college. Instead, she sat in the corner at her own graduation party, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. I tried to talk to her, but she just said she wanted to disappear. I failed her. I failed them all. From 1985, Margaret called today. She's pregnant and terrified. She made me promise to never let her child be alone with father. I swore I'd protect her daughter, but I don't know how. I'm just one person fighting an entire family system designed to protect him. From 1989, Margaret moved to Boston without warning. I understand why. She's trying to protect her little girl, but I'm alone now in knowing the truth. Everyone else acts like nothing happened. Father volunteers at the church youth group, and people praise his dedication to children. It makes me physically ill. I found evidence that Cordelia had tried to reconnect with family members over the years, offering support to anyone who might need it. Letters to distant cousins, holiday cards with careful notes asking about their well-being, newspaper clippings about therapy resources tucked into birthday cards. But the most disturbing discovery was in a locked trunk in the attic. The trunk required a crowbar to open, and inside I found hundreds of photographs spanning 6 decades. Not the horrible documentation photos I'd found earlier, but seemingly innocent family pictures that told a different story when examined carefully. Holiday gatherings where young girls looked uncomfortable, birthday parties where children stood as far from my grandfather as possible, casual snapshots that showed a pattern of inappropriate touching, disguised as normal family affection. Cordelia had been documenting the abuse in plain sight, collecting evidence that most people would dismiss as normal family photos. But once you knew what to look for, the pattern was unmistakable. She'd organized the photos chronologically and annotated them in red ink. Margaret, age 6. Note: defensive posture. Rebecca, age 9. Dissociative stare. Cousin Jennifer, age 5. Attempting to hide behind mother. The annotations revealed that Cordelia had studied child psychology extensively. She understood the behavioral indicators of abuse and had been documenting them systematically for decades. At the bottom of the trunk was a manila folder labeled Current Concerns. Inside were recent photos, printouts from social media accounts, family gatherings from the past 5 years, including some I remembered attending. In these newer photos, Cordelia had circled certain individuals with red pen and written notes in the margins. The handwriting was shakier, clearly written during her final years, but the message was clear. One photo from my cousin's wedding 2 years ago had several red circles. In the margin, Cordelia had written, "Watch Thomas with the flower girls." Same positioning, same inappropriate touches. Pattern continues into next generation. Thomas was Uncle Michael's son, Bethany's brother. He was now 45 with teenage daughters of his own. My blood ran cold as I realized what Cordelia was suggesting. The abuse hadn't ended with my grandfather's death. It had been passed down, continuing the cycle with a new generation of victims. I looked through more recent photos with this horrible new perspective. Thomas at family barbecues, always volunteering to help with the younger children. Thomas offering to give kids rides home from family events. Thomas hosting pool parties where he was always in the water with his daughter's friends. In one particularly disturbing photo from a family reunion, I could see Thomas's hand positioned inappropriately on a young girl's back, while adults smiled and posed for the camera. The girl's expression showed clear discomfort, but everyone else seemed oblivious. Cordelia had circled this image multiple times and written, "Sarah Jenkins, age 8, same positioning father used with Margaret." Cycle repeating. Why does no one see? I thought about conversations over the years, how Thomas's wife Elena had seemed increasingly withdrawn at family gatherings, how she'd started drinking heavily and often left events early with vague excuses about headaches or childcare issues. I remembered how Thomas's older daughter Sophia had become rebellious and distant around age 13, dropping out of family activities and spending most gatherings locked in her room, how his younger daughter, now 15, had stopped coming to family events altogether, claiming she was too busy with school activities. Elena had always made excuses for the girls' absence, but now I wondered if she was trying to protect them from something she couldn't openly acknowledge. Cordelia's final journal entry was dated just weeks before her stroke. "I'm running out of time. My health is failing and I still haven't found a way to stop this cycle. Margaret is too damaged to help. Michael moved away but never dealt with what happened to his family. Now I suspect Thomas is continuing the pattern. Those girls need protection, but I'm too old and sick to fight anymore. I pray someone younger and stronger will find this evidence and finish what I started." I spent that night in Cordelia's house, surrounded by decades of documentation, trying to decide what to do. The magnitude of what I discovered was overwhelming. This wasn't just about historical abuse. There might be children currently at risk. By morning, I knew I couldn't let this evidence sit hidden in boxes while more children potentially suffered. I called the police. Detective Carmen Ramirez arrived within an hour. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor who specialized in family crimes. She listened patiently as I explained what I'd found, occasionally asking for clarification but never seeming skeptical or dismissive. "This is a lot of evidence," she said, looking through the boxes of letters and photos. "Your great-aunt was thorough in her documentation. Even though most of these crimes are beyond the statute of limitations, this information could be crucial if there are current victims." She asked me to bring everything to the station for official documentation. She also warned me that opening this investigation would likely tear my family apart, but that protecting potential victims had to be the priority. "Are you prepared for the consequences?" she asked. "Once we start making calls, there's no going back." I thought about Cordelia, who'd spent 50 years trying to protect children with no support from her family. I thought about the young girls in those recent photos, showing the same signs of distress I'd learned to recognize. "Do it," I said. The investigation moved quickly once it officially began. Detective Ramirez contacted several family members based on Cordelia's evidence, starting with those identified as potential victims. My mother was among the first interviewed. When Detective Ramirez called to schedule a meeting, Mom broke down completely. I was hoping this would stay buried, she said through tears when I visited her that evening. I thought if I just protected you, if I kept you away from all of them, the cycle would end. Tell me what really happened, I said gently. All of it. Mom sat in her kitchen, the same place where she'd made me countless meals while shielding me from a truth I never suspected. She looked older than her 58 years as she began to speak. It started when I was 6, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Every Sunday after church, he'd tell everyone I was helping him in the basement workshop. Your grandmother would go upstairs for her nap, and she couldn't finish. How long did it continue? Until I was 13. That's when he moved on to Rebecca. She was younger, more vulnerable. I tried to protect her, but I was just a kid myself. I felt guilty for being relieved that it wasn't me anymore. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you stop him? I tried, she said, her voice breaking. I told my mother once, when I was 8. She slapped me and said I was a wicked child for making up stories about such a good man. She said if I ever lied like that again, I'd be sent away to a home for troubled girls. After that, I learned to keep quiet. What about Rebecca? He hurt her worse than he hurt me. She was smaller, couldn't fight back as effectively. By the time she was 14, she was having nightmares every night, refusing to eat, talking about wanting to die. That's when she first tried to kill herself. The car accident? Mom nodded, tears streaming down her face. She drove into that tree on purpose. She left a note saying she couldn't live with the memories anymore, that she was tired of being dirty and broken. We told everyone it was an accident. Even at 19, she was still having flashbacks to what he'd done to her when she was little. Did he ever touch me? No, Mom said firmly. Never. I made sure of that. I never left you alone with him, not even for 5 minutes. I watched him like a hawk every family gathering. It's why I was so paranoid about babysitters, about sleepovers, about any adult male around you. It's why we moved to Boston when you were 8. I caught him watching you during your birthday party, and I knew I had to get you away. You should have told me. How do you tell your child that their grandfather is a monster? How do you explain that the man everyone praises as a pillar of the community spent years destroying little girls? I thought if I just kept you safe, if I protected you from him until he died, the cycle would end. But I was starting to understand that the cycle hadn't ended. It had just shifted. Mom, who's Thomas? Cordelia had recent photos of him with young girls. Mom's face went pale. Michael's son, your cousin Bethany's brother. Did Grandpa abuse them too? I think so, but Michael and I never talked about it directly. When Bethany was 8, Michael and his wife suddenly moved across the country. They said it was for his job, but I always wondered if they'd figured out what was happening. We've barely spoken since. There are photos suggesting Thomas might be continuing the pattern. Mom was quiet for a long time, processing this information. His daughters, she said finally. Sophia and Isabella. They're teenagers now. Oh God, if Thomas learned this behavior from watching father. The pieces were falling into place. Childhood abuse often created cycles where victims either became overprotective parents or, in some cases, perpetrators themselves. If Thomas had been abused and had never received help processing that trauma, he might have internalized the behavior as normal. Detective Ramirez worked methodically through Cordelia's evidence, building a case that spanned multiple generations. She contacted Uncle Michael, who initially denied everything, but eventually broke down and admitted he'd suspected his father-in-law was abusing his children. We never talked about it openly, Michael said during his interview, but we noticed behavioral changes in Bethany around age 6. She became withdrawn, started having nightmares, refused to be alone with certain family members. Elena and I made the decision to move away and limit contact with the extended family. Did you ever report your suspicions? No, Michael said, shame evident in his voice. We were young, unsure, and afraid of destroying the family if we were wrong. We thought protecting our own children was enough. What about your son Thomas? Michael's face changed. What about him? We have evidence suggesting he may have been victimized as well, and possibly learned abusive behaviors. The interview ended abruptly as Michael demanded a lawyer. Bethany was more forthcoming when Detective Ramirez contacted her. Now 32 and living across the country, she agreed to speak by phone from her therapist's office. I've been in therapy for 15 years, trying to recover memories of what happened when I was little, she said. I always knew something was wrong with our family. I had nightmares for years, but I could never remember specific details. I just knew I felt unsafe around certain relatives. Can you tell me about your childhood experiences with your grandfather? Fragments. Mostly feelings of fear and shame. I remember hiding whenever he visited. I remember my mother being very protective, never leaving me alone with him. I remember feeling like I was dirty somehow, but not understanding why. What about your brother Thomas? Bethany was quiet for a long time. Thomas was different after we moved away. He became aggressive, started acting out sexually with neighborhood kids. My parents got him therapy, but he was never the same. As an adult, he's always made me uncomfortable around children. There's something predatory about how he interacts with young girls. Have you ever shared these concerns with anyone? I tried talking to my parents about it a few years ago, but they shut down the conversation. They said I was projecting my own trauma onto Thomas unfairly. But I've kept my own children away from family gatherings because of my concerns about him. 3 women came forward during the initial investigation to report childhood abuse by my grandfather. All were family friends or distant relatives who had been too afraid to speak up at the time. Linda Patterson, now 55, had been a neighbor whose mother cleaned our house when she was young. I was 7 when it started, she said during her interview. My mother would bring me along when she cleaned the house. Mr. Richard would always offer to watch me while she worked. He said I could help him in his workshop. I told my mother once that he touched me in private places, but she said I was imagining things. She said rich families like yours were kind to let us work for them, and I shouldn't make up stories that could get her fired. Jennifer Walsh, now 48, was a distant cousin who had visited during summer holidays. I was molested by him every summer from age 6 to 11, she said. My parents thought it was wonderful that Uncle Richard was so attentive to me, so willing to spend time teaching me about farming and woodworking. They had no idea what was really happening in that basement workshop. Susan Martinez, now 42, had been friends with my mother in high school. I went to their house for sleepovers several times, she said. Mr. Richard always seemed to find excuses to come into Margaret's room at night. He said he was checking on us, making sure we were safe, but he would touch me inappropriately and tell me it was our special secret. I was too young to understand that what he was doing was wrong. Each woman described similar patterns: abuse disguised as special attention, threats or manipulation to ensure silence, and family members who dismissed their concerns or blamed them for misunderstanding innocent interactions. 2 weeks into the investigation, Detective Ramirez received a call that changed everything. Thomas's wife Elena had contacted the station, asking to speak with someone about concerns regarding her husband and their daughters. Elena arrived for her interview visibly shaken, accompanied by a victim's advocate. She was a slight woman with prematurely gray hair and nervous mannerisms that suggested years of living in fear. I need to protect my girls, she said without preamble. I should have done something sooner, but I was scared. Detective Ramirez gently encouraged her to share her concern. Thomas has been inappropriate with our daughters for years, Elena said, her voice barely audible. I've caught him in their rooms at night, claiming he was checking on them. I've seen him touch them in ways that made me uncomfortable. When I've confronted him about it, he says I'm being paranoid and jealous. Have your daughters disclosed anything to you? Sophia started having behavioral problems around age 12. She became rebellious, started staying out late, drinking, engaging in risky sexual behavior. When I suggested therapy, Thomas refused, saying she was just going through normal teenage rebellion. What about your younger daughter? Isabella stopped wanting to be alone with her father about a year ago. She's been asking to spend weekends at friends' houses, claiming she has too much homework to attend family events. She's lost weight, seems anxious all the time, and has started having panic attacks. What made you decide to come forward now? Elena pulled out her phone and showed Detective Ramirez a text message from Sophia, who is now 19 and living at college. Mom, I heard about the investigation into Great-Grandpa Richard. I need you to know that Dad did the same things to me that Great-Grandpa did to Aunt Margaret. Isabella is in danger. Please protect her. Detective Ramirez immediately contacted Child Protective Services to ensure Isabella's safety. Thomas was arrested that evening on charges related to child sexual abuse. During his arrest, police searched the family's home and found disturbing evidence. In Thomas's home office, they discovered a hidden hard drive containing thousands of inappropriate images of children, including photos of his own daughters and their friends taken without their knowledge. They also found journals detailing his sexual fantasies about young girls and his belief that what he was doing was normal family bonding that had been practiced in his family for generations. The arrest made local news, and within days, 3 more families came forward with concerns about Thomas's behavior around their children. He had been volunteering as a youth soccer coach for 8 years, potentially giving him access to dozens of victims. The investigation expanded to include his coaching activities. Several former players, now teenagers, disclosed inappropriate touching and grooming behavior that had occurred during team practices and overnight tournaments. During the investigation, more disturbing family connections emerged. Detective Ramirez discovered that Thomas had been in contact with an uncle on his father's side, my grandfather's brother Harold, who had also been accused of abuse but never prosecuted. Harold lived in another state and had a decades-long history of allegations that had been covered up by various family members. The 2 men had been sharing strategies for accessing and grooming victims, creating a network of predators across multiple states. As the investigation deepened, I found myself at the center of a family crisis that spanned 3 generations. Some relatives were supportive, grateful that the truth was finally coming out. Others were furious, accusing me of destroying the family for attention or revenge. Uncle Michael and his wife Elena went through couples therapy to process their guilt over not protecting their children adequately. They'd suspected abuse but had chosen avoidance over confrontation, hoping that distance would solve the problem. We thought if we just moved away and limited contact, we could protect our kids without having to deal with the larger family issues, Michael said during one family meeting. We were cowards. We prioritized our own comfort over the safety of other children. My mother entered intensive therapy to deal with her decades of suppressed trauma. She also began reaching out to other family members who might have been affected, finally breaking the silence that had protected abusers for generations. Cordelia was right, Mom said during one of our conversations. Keeping secrets didn't protect anyone. It just allowed the abuse to continue and enabled new predators to emerge. The most difficult part was confronting how many people had suspected something over the years but hadn't acted. Family friends who'd noticed uncomfortable dynamics, church members who'd seen warning signs, teachers who'd observed behavioral changes in children after family events, community members who'd heard rumors but dismissed them as gossip. Everyone had their reasons for staying silent, not wanting to interfere in family business, not being certain enough to risk accusations, not knowing how to report their concerns effectively. But their collective silence had enabled decades of abuse. Sophia agreed to testify against her father, showing remarkable courage for a 19-year-old who had survived years of trauma. During her victim impact statement, she spoke about the long-term effects of the abuse. I've struggled with depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder since I was 12, she said. I've engaged in self-destructive behaviors, had difficulty trusting people, and battled eating disorders. The abuse affected every aspect of my development and relationships. Isabella, now 16, also chose to speak about her experiences. With the support of a therapist, she disclosed years of inappropriate touching and sexual abuse by her father. I thought it was normal because Dad said it was something special families did together, she said. He told me that great-grandpa had taught him about family love, and that all the women in our family had participated in these traditions. The revelation that Thomas had framed his abuse as family tradition was particularly disturbing. It suggested a deliberate strategy to normalize inappropriate behavior by connecting it to family history. Thomas ultimately pled guilty to multiple charges, including child sexual abuse, possession of child pornography, and exploitation of minors in his role as a youth coach. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse, instead claiming that his actions were misunderstood and that he was being persecuted for family traditions that outsiders couldn't comprehend. The judge responded with disgust. "There are no family traditions that justify the sexual abuse of children. Your attempts to normalize your criminal behavior by claiming it was learned from family members only demonstrates the depth of your manipulation and the danger you pose to society." The investigation ultimately identified 17 victims across 4 decades, ranging from family members to family friends to children Thomas had coached. The youngest victim had been 4 years old when the abuse began. Several victims chose not to prosecute due to statute of limitations issues or personal preferences, but their stories were documented and included in the official record. Many expressed relief that their experiences were finally being acknowledged and validated. The case received significant media attention, particularly because it demonstrated how abuse could be perpetuated across generations when families chose silence over intervention. Victims' advocacy groups used the case to educate communities about recognizing warning signs and reporting concerns. My family slowly began the process of healing, which required brutal honesty about our history and collective failures. We started attending family therapy sessions to learn how to communicate about difficult topics and support survivors effectively. Elena divorced Thomas and changed her and Isabella's last names to distance themselves from his legacy. She also filed civil suits against several family members who had known about the abuse but failed to report it, seeking accountability for their complicity. Sophia transferred to a university across the country to escape local media attention and focus on her recovery. She's studying social work with the goal of helping other abuse survivors. Isabella remained in therapy and slowly began participating in family activities again, though she required significant support to rebuild trust in adult relationships. I spent months going through the rest of Cordelia's belongings, documenting everything for the investigation, and for family members who wanted to understand what had happened. Her house became a strange kind of memorial, a place where one woman's determination to expose the truth had finally led to justice. The music box she'd given me for my 8th birthday was sitting on her dresser. When I wound it up, it played the same haunting melody I remembered. But now I understood why she'd given it to me. Inside the base was a hidden compartment containing a note. "For Margaret's granddaughter. May you have the courage I never found. Break the silence. Protect the children." I still have that music box. Sometimes when I'm feeling overwhelmed by everything that happened, I play it and think about Cordelia, a woman who spent 50 years trying to protect children from predators disguised as loving family members. She never got to see justice served, but her documentation made it possible. Her courage to keep records even when no one believed her ultimately saved other children from suffering the same fate. The hardest part has been accepting that my entire childhood was built on lies designed to protect child abusers' reputations. Every family story, every fond memory of my grandfather, every holiday tradition, all of it was tainted by the knowledge of what he'd done to vulnerable children. But I've also learned about the incredible strength of survivors like my mother, Rebecca, and Bethany. They endured unimaginable trauma and still managed to build lives, protect their own children where possible, and eventually find the courage to speak their truth. The investigation led to changes in local policies regarding how abuse allegations are handled. The police department implemented new training for officers responding to historical abuse cases, emphasizing the importance of taking delayed disclosures seriously. The school district where Thomas had coached revised their background check procedures and mandatory reporting protocols. Several other youth organizations in the area also updated their safeguarding policies as a result of the case. Cordelia's house sold 6 months after the investigation concluded. The new owners are a young family with 2 small daughters. Before they moved in, I told them about Cordelia. Not about the abuse, but about how she'd spent her life trying to protect children. They're planning to turn her basement workshop into a playroom. I think she would have liked that. The family has slowly started to heal, though the process will take years. We're learning to have honest conversations about what happened and how to prevent it from happening again. It's painful work, but it's necessary. Mom and I talk regularly now, without the weight of secrets between us. She's proud that I found the courage to act on Cordelia's evidence, to finish what she started. "You did what I couldn't do," she told me recently. "You chose protecting children over protecting the family image." Cordelia would be so proud. I've connected with other family abuse survivors through support groups, learning that our story isn't unique. Many families have similar patterns of abuse that persist for generations because of collective silence and denial. 6 months after Thomas's conviction, I received a letter from one of his victims, a young woman who'd been abused when she was on his soccer team. She thanked me for coming forward, for making it possible for her to speak up about what had happened to her. "I thought I was alone," she wrote. "Finding out there were other victims, that there was documentation going back decades, helped me understand that what happened wasn't my fault. Your great aunt was a hero for keeping those records, even when no one believed her." That letter sits framed on my desk now, a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing discoveries can lead to the most important revelations. I've also started volunteering with a local organization that provides support to abuse survivors and education about preventing child sexual abuse. My experience navigating the legal system and family dynamics has been helpful to other families dealing with similar situations. The work is emotionally challenging, but deeply meaningful. Every child we help protect, every family we support through disclosure and investigation, honors Cordelia's legacy and the courage of all the survivors who spoke up. Cordelia spent 50 years documenting abuse that everyone else chose to ignore. She died before seeing justice served, but her meticulous record-keeping ultimately protected countless children and led to the prosecution of multiple predators. The most disturbing thing I found while cleaning out her belongings wasn't the evidence of abuse itself. It was the realization of how many people had known or suspected what was happening and chosen to stay silent, enabling the abuse to continue across multiple generations. But the most inspiring thing I found was proof that one person's refusal to give up, to stop fighting for vulnerable children, can eventually change everything. Even when it takes 50 years to achieve justice, even when the original advocate doesn't live to see the results, their courage and documentation can save lives. That's Cordelia's true legacy. Not the dark family secrets she exposed, but the courage she modeled for future generations. The courage to believe victims, to document truth, and to never stop fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes or how much resistance you face. Her story reminds me that silence is not protection, that family loyalty should never supersede child safety, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to expose the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. Today, when I wind up that music box and listen to its haunting melody, I don't hear sadness anymore. I hear the sound of secrets finally broken, of children finally protected, of justice finally served. I hear the sound of courage triumphing over silence, even when that triumph takes half a century to achieve. Cordelia's fight is over, but the work continues. Every day, there are children who need protection, families who need support, and communities that need education about recognizing and reporting abuse. Her documentation showed us that individual courage can create lasting change, that truth eventually surfaces, and that protecting children is always worth the cost. The music box still plays, still tells its story, still reminds us that some fights are too important to abandon, no matter how long they take or how much they cost. Cordelia understood that. She spent her life proving it, and now it's our turn to carry that legacy forward.